Last night you looked at the clock, calculated how many hours of sleep you'd get, and set an alarm for a job that starts long before your body is ready. You do this almost every night. It feels like the most natural thing in the world. The schedule, the shift, the block of hours you owe somebody else before you're allowed to rest. But for nearly all of human history, that transaction didn't exist. Homo sapiens has walked this planet for roughly 300,000 years. The 8-hour shift, the fixed work week, the idea that most of your waking life belongs to an employer, that's maybe 2 centuries old. Do the math and something strange happens. Over 99.9% of the time humans have existed, nobody clocked in anywhere. So what did they do instead? Not nothing. Anthropologists who actually lived alongside surviving hunter-gatherer groups found something that still unsettles economists today. Once you hear it, you won't look at your own week the same way. Here's the deeper question underneath all of it. If the earliest humans worked less than you do, why does modern life, with all its labor-saving machines, feel like it leaves you with less time than ever? In 1963, an anthropologist named Richard Borshay Lee moved in with the hoansi, a hunting and gathering people of the Kalahari Desert in what is now Namibia and Botswana. He wanted to measure something nobody had measured properly before: exactly how many hours a so-called primitive society actually spent finding food. He expected exhaustion, constant scrambling. A population 1 bad week from starvation. Instead, he clocked their subsistence work at roughly 15 to 20 hours a week. In some of the weeks he recorded, adults spent as few as 2 full days gathering or hunting enough to feed the entire camp. 15 to 20 hours. Less than half of a standard modern work week. The rest of their waking time went to rest, visiting, storytelling, childcare, and craft, repairing tools, making jewelry, arguing about who owed whom a piece of meat from last month's hunt. When the anthropologist Marshall Sahlins published Lee's numbers in 1972, he gave the idea a name that still makes people uncomfortable: the original Affluent Society. Not affluent because they had more. Affluent because they wanted less, and what they wanted, the land mostly provided by early afternoon. This wasn't a one-off. Decades later, the anthropologist Frank Marlowe spent years documenting the Hadza of Tanzania, one of the last populations on Earth still living primarily by hunting and gathering. His data told a similar story. 4 to 6 hours a day of active subsistence effort, with long stretches of the day spent simply present with each other. And the food itself didn't come from where you'd assume. Marlowe found that Hadza men often returned from a hunt with nothing at all. Large game is rare and unreliable. It was the women's gathering, steady and almost guaranteed every single day, that kept camps fed. The dependable economy wasn't the dramatic one. Picture an ordinary day inside that economy. Cool morning air before the heat rises. A few hours spent digging roots or tracking animal signs. Back at camp by early afternoon, food shared out regardless of who found it. Then the long, unhurried middle of the day, repairing a bow, teaching a child to knap a blade, arguing over nothing in particular. This wasn't rest earned after work. In this economy, there was no boundary between the two to earn your way across. No manager was waiting at the end of it to ask what you'd produced. Notice what's missing from that description. No separate category called work and another called life. For most of human history, getting food, making tools, and being with your people weren't competing demands on a limited clock. They were the same activity, done at a human pace, stopped when enough was enough. There's also a reason nobody in that camp tried to outwork everyone else. The anthropologist Christopher Boehm spent decades studying how foraging bands enforce equality, not through law, but through mockery. A hunter who bragged about a big kill got teased mercilessly until he learned to downplay it. Someone who tried to hoard more than their share risked being quietly frozen out of the group. Boehm called this a reverse dominance hierarchy, the whole community actively working to keep any one person from rising too far above everyone else. Work harder than the day required, and the reward wasn't status, it was ridicule. In 2004, the anthropologist Polly Wiesner compared what hoansi conversation sounded like during the day against what it sounded like at night, around the fire. Daytime talk ran mostly on economics, complaints, gossip, negotiating who owed what to whom. But once the sun dropped and the fire took over, the subject changed completely. In Wiesner's recordings, storytelling made up roughly 80% of firelit conversation. Myths, jokes, songs, accounts of distant relatives and long-dead ancestors told and retold almost every night. The freed-up hours weren't wasted time. They were where culture actually happened. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. You might assume all those extra hours went to sleep. That ancient humans, with no artificial light stealing their evenings, simply slept longer and woke gently with the sun. The sleep researcher Jerome Siegel tested that assumption directly. In 2015, his team fitted members of 3 modern forager and forager-farmer societies, the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Namibia, and the Tsimane of Bolivia, with sleep-tracking devices for weeks at a time. The results surprised almost everyone in the field. These populations slept, on average, between 6.5 and 7.25 hours a night. That's the same range, or even less, than the average person sleeps in an industrialized country today. They didn't wake at sunrise either. Their sleep onset tracked the drop in temperature after sunset, not the darkness itself, and they often stayed awake well into the night around the fire. So the extra hours weren't sleep. They were something rarer, and something modern life has quietly engineered out of most days. Unstructured, unscheduled, human time. Time with no employer, no meeting, no notification attached to it. Then, around 12,000 years ago, something shifted the entire equation, and it wasn't the invention people usually credit with making life easier. Agriculture arrived. And against almost every assumption baked into the word progress, it made people work harder, not less. Grain sitting in a storage pit doesn't work the same way meat around a fire does. It doesn't spoil by evening. It doesn't need to be shared before it rots. And it can't be shamed out of someone's hands the way a boastful hunter could be. For the first time, hoarding actually worked. And the leveling mechanisms that had kept foraging bands equal for millennia had nothing left to push against. A field of grain doesn't feed itself. It needs clearing, planting, weeding, guarding from animals, harvesting in a narrow window, storing before it rots, and defending once it's stored. Because now, for the first time, there was something worth stealing. Surplus created property. Property created the need for constant labor to protect and grow it. Bioarchaeologists studying skeletons from the first farming villages found a clear signature of the switch: worn joints from repetitive labor, more dental disease from grain, heavy diets, and average height that dropped compared to the foragers who came before them. The anthropologist James Sussman, who spent decades among the hoansi and later wrote an entire history of human labor, put the pattern plainly. Scarcity wasn't the natural condition our ancestors escaped through hard work. Scarcity was something farming, and later industrial economies manufactured, a permanent, low-grade sense that there is never quite enough and never quite enough time to get it. that manufactured scarcity didn't disappear when farming gave way to factories, or when factories gave way to laptops. It just kept changing shape. Industrialization then took that logic and gave it a clock. Factories needed workers who arrived at the same hour, stayed a fixed number of hours, and left only when a bell said so. The historian E.P. Thompson described this as a shift from task orientation to clock orientation, from doing a job until it was done to selling fixed blocks of time regardless of what filled them. The 8-hour day wasn't handed down from nature. It was fought for, negotiated, and legislated, replacing the 12- and 14-hour factory shifts that came before it. Somewhere in that fight, the idea that a job should structure most of your waking life stopped looking, invented, and started looking permanent. Even the 8-hour day, hard-won as it was, still drew a line. When the shift ended, the factory gate closed behind you. What replaced that gate over the last 2 decades isn't a shorter workday. It's a phone in your pocket that never really clocks out, quietly dissolving the one boundary industrial workers spent a century fighting to build. Your body doesn't know the difference. The same nervous system that once regulated a hoansi forager's 15-hour week is the one dragging you out of bed for a fixed shift it never evolved to expect. The same instinct that once meant gather enough, then rest, now gets overridden by a calendar built by people you've never met, for reasons that have nothing to do with how much food is actually available to you. The psychologist Ashley Whillans has spent her career studying what she calls time famine, the chronic feeling of having less time than you need. Her research keeps turning up the same uncomfortable result. People who feel time poor report lower well-being than people who have less money but more unstructured hours. Given the choice, most say they would trade a raise for a single extra hour in the day, and then take the raise anyway, because the system rarely hands anyone the hour as an option. Somewhere along the way, we optimized for output and quietly deprioritized the one resource every forager on the Kalahari had in abundance. We didn't get more efficient and buy back our time with it. We built machines that could do a day's labor in an hour, and somehow ended up with less unscheduled time than a hunter-gatherer eating wild mongongo nuts in the Kalahari 60 years ago. That's not a coincidence of technology. It's a choice made by systems, generation after generation, about who gets to keep the hours a machine frees up. We call it progress because the food is more reliable and the roof doesn't leak. But reliability came with a bill nobody itemized for us, the 20 extra hours a week that used to belong to no one but the person living them. Tonight, you'll set that alarm again. You'll do the math on your sleep, same as always. But the clock on your nightstand isn't measuring how much rest your body needs. It's measuring a system that's maybe 200 years old, dressed up in the authority of something ancient. For 300,000 years, nobody needed permission to stop working for the day. Somewhere between the first planted seed and the first factory bell, that permission quietly disappeared, and most of us never even noticed it was gone.